On the latest episode of Getting to Know Jew, we speak with Tamara Falicov. Falicov is the inaugural dean of the new School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So we chat about the way higher education is changing, how Falikov's Jewish experience informs her work as a dean, and how the KC Jewish community helped her meet her husband. Hi, Tamara. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, what's the story behind the UMKC School of Humanities and Social Sciences? It's new, but for listeners who may not be familiar with, the ins and outs of academic reshuffling at universities, why does this new school matter?
Well, thanks for asking, Lev. Yes, this is an exciting new development, and it's a great opportunity for me to share with people how UMKC is reconceptualizing the needs for higher education post-pandemic. My understanding is that the chancellor of UMKC launched a program called UMKC Forward, where they were really thinking about how do we realign the university after this really critical time when students couldn't come to campus. We had to shift online. This is across the board, across the country. And while this was terrible, and I was at a different institution at the time, it gave us an opportunity to really rethink what the priorities needed to be and what do the students really want to study. And so my understanding about this new school is that this is a way for the humanities and social sciences to come together, create a new identity. This involves the arts as well. And we really want to be community focused. We see the arts and humanities not as a dying group of disciplines that don't have relevance today. In fact, they're more relevant than ever. And so we're pairing these disciplines with community engaged research and figuring out ways that the work can impact our local communities. And that's going to draw students because they care about where they live and they want to make it a better place. It also affords the STEM school to consolidate, and they're doing something really interesting as well, where they're bringing in urban planning and even considering not having set disciplines, but doing more interdisciplinary work. And that's very exciting to me because I come from an institution where I started moving into doing interdisciplinary research because I found it to be very, very innovative. And so I think to have me come to this new School of Humanities and Social Sciences will afford an opportunity to work together with the community and internally, and at the same time, continue to bridge the disciplinary divide with the STEM fields as well. So as much as we're separate, we're still going to be communicating.
Can you say a little bit more about sort of maybe what lessons from the pandemic or, what specific lessons are being drawn into to make the school a sort of better academic experience and a better community experience? Because it feels like as we all sort of receded to Zoom in our computers, working together, as you're talking about, became all the more so important to stay on the same page and be able to get things done. So if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Definitely. I mean, I think that there are a couple things happening at the same time. And so this confluence of events have created this space. So we'll start with the pandemic. I mentioned this briefly, that people, when they sent their children to college, they had an idea about what the on-campus experience was. Well, with the pandemic, that wasn't possible. So parents were very reticent about, oh my gosh, this shift to online learning. What does this mean? Now, if you've been in higher ed for a long time, you know that that online learning can actually be an amazing space. And it can actually be a very inclusive space for people who live far away. As long as they can get internet access, there's a lot of potential there. But we understood that, yes, they want the students living on the campus, and this wasn't a possibility. So that was a problem. So that was going to lower our tuition enrollments across the board. Concurrent to that, where I have worked my whole life and where I've gone to school my whole life is public schools. I am a proponent of public education. I was at UC San Diego for my doctorate, UC Berkeley for undergrad. I was at University of Kansas for 24 years. and now University of Missouri, Kansas City. So I am a child who believes I'm a child of the state system in the sense that I know that there is so much opportunity there. But what's been happening for the past 20 years? Well, the state, as far as the legislatures is concerned, has been cutting back on helping to fund higher education. So there's been a rollback and a distrust, or whatever the party line is, to cut education. And this has been a very big problem because it means that if we don't have student tuition money and we don't have state funding, then what happens is that tuition has to be the main source of revenue. And what do we have to do? Increase tuition. Students can't afford to go to school now. It's too expensive. I was really lucky when I went to my public schools because they were not cheap, but they were affordable. I mean, if you could manage, I did not have to work. Whereas now my students have to work 2 jobs. So that gives you an example. So what happens when students now have to really be serious in terms of every dollar spent? Every dollar has to count. It should have always counted, but now it's really on the students to decide, okay, will this guarantee me a job or not? I mean, they have to think in these very practical terms. And I think that that's important. I'm not saying that you should have gone before and thinking very frivolously. No. But I was fortunate in that my parents basically said, you need to explore all the liberal arts. And, for us, we want you to think critically, have good communication skills. And that's what I did as an undergraduate. And we do that still at UMKC. However, in addition to the liberal arts education, which, it means that the whole person needs to be developed, a global citizen, be ethical in their lives. I mean, this is just part of being a whole person. We're adding in more emphasis on professional career development while they're undergraduates. How can a course in history or a course in sociology or in media, art, or design have real world implications? I did not have that growing up. In fact, I went to a university where basically they looked down on that. It was seen as a trade school idea, or VOTEC, which I always found very classist and very elitist. This is how higher ed is changing now. Higher ed is saying we need to make people aware of the world, good people, critical thinkers, and we have to figure out how can we help our students find internships, connect with community members, give back, do service learning, and help others come to the university with these opportunities.
So how did you end up as the inaugural dean for the new school? Was this something you knew you wanted to do, or did it take some convincing from friends and colleagues?
These are great questions that I love to think about because this can be useful for anyone who's thinking about leadership opportunities. I will tell you that when I started as an assistant professor, I was very lucky. My parents are immigrants from Argentina. I was able to see cinema from Argentina as a high school kid. I knew that that's the kind of research focus I wanted to take. So I was very academic in my thinking when I first started. And I really felt that my goal was to be a bridge between Latin American culture and cinema and the United States, because I was born in this country. And I still believe in this mission. However, over time, I started realizing that the people who were in my department when I first started had very traditional ideas. And that there's nothing wrong with that. But I felt like as somebody coming in to the department that I wanted to make a difference, especially for the students. And so I started this track of leadership and became chair of the department. We're a brand new department of film and media studies. We had broken away from theater. I was the first chair. So I'd already done kind of an inaugural branding, new identity kind of exercise. And I really, really enjoyed it. We set up internships for students, and they went to LA for spring break and met alums and did all these things. And I just got so empowered by that. And I felt so happy. And I just knew this is the path I wanted to continue. And then in 2017, there was this call for an associate dean for research in the arts and humanities. And I'll be honest, that seemed very lofty for me. And I thought you had to be like this top researcher to be the associate dean for research. But what ended up happening is one of my colleagues nominated me. And I'm telling you this kind of inner workings of my mind, because this is especially important for women, people of color, folks who are not in the dominant culture, who don't necessarily always feel like they see themselves represented all the time. Sometimes you think, oh, could I actually assume that leadership role? There's this concept of imposter syndrome, which is frankly societal. And so oftentimes, especially for women, when there are these leadership opportunities, it often takes other people to nominate, to convince, to suggest they would be perfect for this role. Don't they see this? And that's what it took for me. I just wasn't 100% sure. And I'm not alone. This is very common. And so I think if you know people, or if you yourself are not sure about taking on leadership, you need a cohort of people, you need supports, and they're going to convince you and they're going to tell you to go for it. And I'm very grateful for that experience, because then after 5 years of being an associate dean, I definitely felt like I built up the skills that were needed to become a dean. I was told by my mentors, Tamara, you could be a dean. And again, this is for folks who are in leadership already. Say these things. Tell people that you work with, that you supervise, if they have what it takes, because they don't forget it. It is empowering. You feel that confidence. But not just the confidence, honestly, it was the skills. I really was able to get a lot of opportunities figuring out how to do the things that are involved. And I won't bore you with all the bureaucratic things that we have to do. But then when the job came about, I had heard that the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at UMKC was going to split in two. And I was intrigued with the idea. And again, it was people at UMKC who said, did you see this? These are not necessarily folks in the college itself, but even outside of the college were like, hey, so they were sort of neutral, like, hey, you should look into this. And I just thought that for where I am now in my position, given the kinds of research that I'm doing at this moment versus how I started, it would be an excellent fit for the kind of work that they want to achieve at UMKC.
So kind of in line with the inclusivity aspect, in May, I believe you were awarded the Faculty Mentor of the Year Award through the McNair Scholars Program, which is for first-generation undergraduate students of color interested in pursuing graduate degrees. Given that, I think it's sort of also appropriate to ask, what's your outlook on making the new UMKC school more inclusive and welcoming to students of color, or, all the variety of groups that sort of have not typically been well represented?
No, I think this is very important. I mean, the good news is slowly but surely, and it's not done well all the time, universities and other institutions are increasingly interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And the good news is that where I was previously, there was a move in that regard. And I felt very strongly that in the college, we adopt these kinds of guidelines for the ways in which we hire, we recruit, we retain faculty and students. So I had the opportunity to be the equity advisor for the college last year. And I definitely learned so much. We had a group of people, a committee, it was a dean's cabinet. And yes, it is mainly people of color that bear the burden of having to educate people about equity and inclusion and diversity initiatives. But it doesn't make sense if you think about it when, in fact, all of us are working together and we all need to be educated on how to be respectful and treat people the way they should be treated, right, as human beings, and be aware of people's differences. I think that for me, this kind of issue is so personal, and that is why it's just easy. I talked about my immigrant parents. Spanish was their first language. That was my first language. I was teased as a kid for bringing weird, quote unquote, foods to school. If you've seen my big fat Greek wedding, she brings moussaka to lunch and someone calls it mouskaka. And I just laughed so hard because I understood that. Also, being Jewish, being from a Latin American country or having roots there, I always felt like I could see different perspectives. I faced some anti-Semitism growing up in San Diego. That made me actually embrace my identity even more. Interestingly enough, when you are put down for who you are, you can either internalize that racism or anti-Semitism or sexism, or you can say, actually, this is who I am, and I'm going to be myself. And so I think it's not a process that should be siloed, that should be separated from everything else. D&I work, which is how I believe that is the term they use at UMKC, is integrated. It should be integrated. At least that's what I believe we should do in the new school, in everything that we do, in the ways in which we think about curriculum, in the ways that we think about diverse faculty. I talked earlier about representation matters, hearing different perspectives, challenging students, trying to get different people in the room. I taught a course, quite a while ago on Cuban cinema that I feel really proud of because the country of Cuba has always been maligned. It's a Cold War kind of vestige where the United States has just marginalized this country. And there, and then in Cuba, there's just all these things that have happened in history. So long story short, we talked about the history. We had Cuban Americans in my class. Well, their parents were angry at what happened and they came over here. And so we had different perspectives. We did not skirt the difficult topics. I think that these are touchy conversations to have. It's stressful, but we can figure out a language that people can understand to understand more, to reach an understanding about how we have different viewpoints and that we have to understand and dialogue to understand where they're coming from. Because what happens right now is we shut down. We're uncomfortable. We're fragile. And so we don't want to know. And that's what we need to work on. And we need to make sure that there's something for sounds so cheesy, something for everyone. We need to provide a lot of different perspectives in our curriculum and do things that, like I said before, around community engagement that is welcoming to all the high schools in the area, not pick and choose. There's some research that was done about how some universities purposefully recruited students from the wealthier schools and the whiter schools. And thank goodness that is not happening anymore. We have to right the wrongs of history in the ways that we can.
So you mentioned this a little bit, but I want to ask a little bit more. How does Judaism then influence your work, both in terms of the research that you do and also, as you're sort of being the dean and putting together the administrative and bureaucratic sort of stuff to make higher education work?
Well, for me, I think I always use the term dominant culture. And I think that this is a good word because it basically means the ways in which we see, for example, the calendar. The calendar will say that you have these holidays. We have Thanksgiving, we have Christmas. And we just use those terms. They're so naturalized because that's just our culture. This is how we were raised. We don't think twice about it. They're just supposedly neutral words. And so for me, this is just a small example of how I always would remind people that I had other holidays that we celebrated at home, which I shouldn't be laughing about it but it makes me laugh in a way because it just seems so obvious. But we're still in 2022 not seeing these things all the time. And so just really standing up and being a voice and saying, well, actually, there's this holiday that Muslims celebrate. We should not be holding an event this day. That we just have to be conscious of other people and they're not necessarily going to stand up and tell you these things. It's just really putting this stuff and making it, front and center, being aware of other people's cultural practices, faith practices. Maybe that's where it comes from, is just understanding that I was othered as a kid. And look, I have white skin privilege. I am aware of that. I know that I have it much easier than a lot of people, but there are a few times where, we get sidelined and people don't want to talk about it. And then they don't want to even broach the topic. And so I would just say like, hey, it's Rosh Hashanah right now. It's the new year. And then if somebody said Happy New Year to me, I would be so happy. A lot of times they would just say nothing because they somehow think you have to separate those things I mean, I get it, separation of church and state, but wishing someone a happy holiday is not the same thing. So I think it's just having conversations, educating people, not being shy about it, not trying to fit in. What does fitting in mean? Fitting into what? The word inclusive, to be honest, is also problematic if you think about it, because it means you're going to be included into this thing, this structure, this system that exists, when in fact, we should be changing the structure to change it inherently so that we're not being included. We are just part of it. Do you see what I mean? And so we're getting there. Right now, inclusive means getting into the dominant culture, being respected, being seen, basically.
So the last question I have for you is sort of the fun last question for every one of these podcast episodes that we ease out on. What's your favorite part of the Kansas City Jewish community?
Wow. Okay. I might have to go over 3 minutes. We'll see, because there's so much I can say about this. And I'm going to tell you a personal story about it, and maybe this will resonate with some. So I grew up in San Diego, California, as I said, not in a Jewish neighborhood, but with parents who always felt that this was very important to our family. We would always celebrate the holidays, and we would invite our Catholic friends for various, life cycle events or things like Passover, for example. They were always included. It was lovely. So then when I came to Kansas City, I thought that it would be nice to be connected with the Jewish community. And when I was in graduate school at UC San Diego, I did join a young adult group, and I loved it. I made some great friends that way. So it just made sense that this was something that I wanted to do. And I knew that if I was going to actually move to Kansas City from Lawrence, I'll just tell you briefly about that I had to figure out an excuse to be able to come to Kansas City. Lawrence was a little small for me personally. I had just been living in Argentina for a year to research my dissertation. I was a Fulbright scholar. I wanted to get to know my family, and I wanted to really immerse myself and write a good, later book. Nonetheless, coming to Lawrence, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to volunteer at the Jewish Film Festival. This is film studies. I study film festivals. That's part of my research as well. Maybe I'll connect with folks there. Long story short, I connected with a young adult group when I first got there. I ended up meeting my husband. We're the poster children for the Jewish Film Festival. So, hey, folks, volunteer for the things that you love, and you will make beautiful connections with people. It'll just come naturally. You'll just do what you love. That's my advice. I'm also, it sounds like I'm a dating coach. I'm not. But, this is just something to think about. So the Jewish Film Festival was a great platform for me. I was also heavily involved with the Latin American Film Festival. I would bring in Jewish films in Latin America, like my family, right? Latin American themed Jewish films, all these lovely combinations. And the Jewish community, I would say, is, it is pretty suburban. I'm going to do a shout out to those urban Jews who are affiliated with the congregation. There's also New Reform Temple. Shout out to them. But whether or not you're affiliated with the synagogue, there are so many people doing so many amazing things. And one thing that I connected with very heavily was a group of friends called, we created Tov KC, which was a social justice group through Beth Torah and through Federation. And we partnered with a farmer, and we had a CSA, a Jewish community-supported agriculture relationship with a farmer. And many years later, I'm still hosting a CSA on my front porch. It's not necessarily a Jewish one, but that planted the seeds in terms of thinking about sustainability, the environment. So I've definitely found a home here in Kansas City Jewishly, and I'm very grateful for that.
I got to say, I did not come into this interview expecting I met my husband at the Jewish Film Festival. So that's pretty cool.
That is very cool. And I just never know. And that it does not hurt to meet your life partner in the city that you move to. You can establish roots there. I'll just say, in terms of the Jewish community, we have 3 children. I'll say their names because people will recognize these names. Ilan, Avital, and Noah. And all three kids, they go to public school. They're at a French immersion school here in Kansas City, but they belong to a congregation. My son just had his bar mitzvah. So we figure out a way to adopt Judaism in a way that feels really authentic to us and that connects with people in Kansas City. And it's super important. And I'm just grateful to be invited to be part of this podcast. Thank you so much.
The Getting to Know Jew podcast is a product of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City. It is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network and produced by Jewfolk Inc. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. If you have suggestions for future guests, please email the show at webmaster@jewishkc.org.